Good morning. Today we are celebrating the Epiphany. Now we don't know much about the three wise men that comes from the Bible. We aren't really told in the Bible that there were only three. We don't really know where they're from. Matthew says in the Gospel that they were magi from the east. Now the earliest known usage of the word magi is from the Behistun inscription, which is a carving on the side of a cliff in western Iran, completed sometime around 500 BC or so. It commemorates the victory and the rise to power of the Persian king Darius the Great, who ruled Persia from 522 to 486. He was the same king of Persia who helped and encouraged Ezra the prophet with the rebuilding of the Jewish temple after the Israelites were set free from the Babylonian captivity. So this carving, the Behistun inscription, is 300 feet up on the side of a cliff and has images of Darius trampling his foes, accompanied by descriptions of his victories in 3 languages. Magi are mentioned in these descriptions. They're understood to be a priestly class in the royal court, priests of the Persian god Aramazda, who is mentioned several times in this Behistun inscription. So Magi from the east, as Matthew describes it, most likely means priests of a pagan god from Persia, which is present-day Iran. Now in our Catholic tradition, we have found names for the Magi, and traditionally we say they are from Persia, Ethiopia, and India. But that doesn't make them any less pagan. They are still astrologers looking for signs in the stars. And at the birth of Jesus, they found such a sign. They saw a star so big, a star so bright, so obviously new and magnificent that they studied and speculated and astrologized for 2 years. And then they traveled to find the king of the Jews, born in Judea, who was indicated by this star. Now, this was a big deal to travel all the way to Israel from Persia to pay homage to a king that no one in Israel was even talking about. You see, these astrologers from Persia, they had an epiphany. That's what we're celebrating today. An epiphany is a sudden perception of the meaning of something, an illuminating discovery, or a realization of the truth of something. Now, who the Magi are is an important part of this story, because you see, God is making himself known to non-believers. He is sending them to deliver a message, to spread the news. Now these Magi, who had no innate knowledge of the Jewish tradition of the Messiah, they had an illuminating realization, an understanding of the essential meaning of the star. They had an epiphany. The Magi realized that this star that they were observing indicated the birth of the new king. They realized that they should go to Israel, pay their respects to this new king. So they came to Jerusalem to seek out the new king illuminated by this new star. Now we celebrate the Magi to commemorate the manifestation and the realization of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. We talk about this event to show that Jesus Christ is not just the King of the Jews, but he is in fact the King of the universe. He is the King of all people everywhere. All people everywhere. And he can make himself manifest or known to anyone and everyone, regardless of that person's religious beliefs or Christian understanding. Now Herod and the rest of Jerusalem, of course, are taken completely by surprise. New king, they said. We don't have any new king. They hadn't noticed the star, I suppose, since traditionally in monotheism, we don't study the stars. We don't usually place spiritual value and meaning on what the stars and the celestial bodies are doing or not doing. As monotheists, the Israelites weren't in touch with the universe in that way. You see, studying the stars, that's something that pagans did. That's something that people who didn't know the one true God would do. Jewish priests and rabbis, they weren't out there looking for meaning in the stars. They were inside, praying by the tabernacle. They missed the sign. But the chief priests and the scribes in Jerusalem, now they probably should have known about Jesus and the Messiah. When Herod asked them where the Christ was to be born, they'd pipe right up. In Bethlehem of Judea, of course. Got a prophecy about it and everything. They had the prophecy. They had the knowledge, but they still missed it. They didn't have any of their own epiphanies about it. You see, sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the daily grind, to get caught up in our own lives, to miss the big picture, to miss the essential meaning of something, especially if the signs are coming from unexpected places. Now, these days, we aren't going to make that same mistake again. These days, the Vatican has its own observatory and a chief astronomer. And I assume he has a staff of other astronomers that he is the chief over, a whole team of scientists studying the heavens. We're not going to miss any new stars or any new anything else. We're not going to get shown up by these Persian astrologers again, I can tell you that. Now, this is one of the great things about this story. It shows just how much outside the box God is. Outside the box that we create for him. Outside of the box that makes sense to us. You see, we can have all the prophecies, we can have all the knowledge, all the history, all the writings, but it's pagan astrologers who have an epiphany about the true nature and essential meaning of Jesus Christ. It's priests and practitioners of what we would probably call the dark arts that God comes to, that God inspires to come and worship the King. Just when we think we have it all figured out, God comes to the pagans. You see, God is not bound by our boxes. The Epiphany demonstrates that God is universal. God is here for everyone. Salvation is accessible to all people, regardless of background, regardless of history, regardless of anything. God can and does make himself known to any and all people. Thus, we are all capable of an epiphany. Like the Magi, it might take us a couple of years of looking at the signs before we understand what it is and are ready to make the journey. But like he did for the Magi, God will show us the way. He will lead us where he wants us to be. The Apostle Paul talks about an epiphany he had in our second reading. His epiphany was pretty much what this story of the Magi is telling us, that Jesus came for everybody, Jew and Gentile alike. Paul realized that Jesus came to save the followers of the one true God, but also the followers of Mazda or any of the other pagan gods. God came to anyone, and anyone can have an epiphany, an illuminating realization of the essential nature and the meaning of Jesus coming into the world. And when we have that epiphany, that realization that Jesus Christ came into this world not to condemn, but to save us, to show us how to love one another, and how to forgive one another, and how to treat one another, well, it changes our life. And like the Magi, it doesn't matter what kind of heathen you are or where you came from. Once you know, once you've seen, once you've had this epiphany, well, then it changes your life. You follow where God leads you. You follow the way of his son, Jesus. You see, that's what the early church called itself, the way. As Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And the good news is the way is open for anybody. Even a Magi can follow Christ. Many times we like to think that we Christians have a monopoly on conversations with God. But God can call out to and he can talk to whomever he chooses. We want to think that God will only speak to us, that he will only reveal his truth to us, that he'll only ask us to do things, but that's just not true. You see, that's what this story shows us. That just because we think we have it all figured out, that just because we think we know what God is going to do, where he's going to speak to us from, God can still always surprise us. From the beginning, God has revealed the truth of Jesus Christ to sinners as well as saints, to believers and unbelievers alike. God can bring his message to us from unexpected places, and he very often does. Back in Israel, Herod and the chief priests and the scribes had to hear about the birth of the Christ child from Persian magicians. How embarrassing that must have been for them. I mean, it's their Messiah, after all, foretold in their prophecies, and these pagan priests get the message first? I wonder how many other messages God has sent to his people by way of a pagan. Do we listen to God's message if it comes from an unlikely source? Or do we dismiss it, try to stamp it out the way that Herod did? You see, God can reveal himself and inspire people that we would not think have any business talking to our God, people that don't fit into our box of who should speak for God. But our God cannot be contained by our box that we try to put him into, the box of who he's allowed to talk to, how he's allowed to do it, who is allowed to share God's message. So don't put yourself into that box, a box of knowing when and where you will encounter God. Look for him in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. Look for him in the writings and the teachings of St. Francis or St. Teresa or St. Augustine. But don't be surprised if you also find bits of God's wisdom in some of the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, or some of the teachings of the Dalai Lama, or some of the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. God does speak his truth to all peoples. And some of them understand that truth and pass it along, whether they understand the bigger truth of salvation or not. Now, the Bible doesn't say if our Magi converted and led a big old revival when they got back to Persia. I like to think that they did. But in the Bible, it says that God spoke to them in a dream after they saw Jesus, and he told them in this dream not to go back to Herod. So instead, they just went back to their own country. They probably went back to studying the stars, but with a deeper understanding of God's direction of the cosmos, a deeper understanding given to them in an epiphany that led them to encounter Christ. An epiphany that led them to set an unexpected example of how to listen to God when he speaks and gives us signs, an example of how to go where God leads us and to bring the message that he gives us to bring. The Epiphany teaches us that God is constantly at work in the universe, reaching out, making contact with all sorts of people in all sorts of places, making himself known to them, revealing his glory to them, leading us to recognize and encounter his Son. And the Epiphany teaches us that even we in our knowledge and understanding can and do miss God's signs sometimes. But the most important thing that we can learn from the story of the wise men is that God can and does make himself known to us, that God can and does give us sudden realization of his will for us, that God can and does show us the way and lead us to where he wants us to be, and that God can and does use all of us in his grand designs, even pagans and heathens and non-believers like the Magi. So have a very blessed and wonderful Epiphany and a very happy and fruitful new year.